Good evening, everyone. So, as we prepare for Shavuos, I wanted to do a mini series on what exactly happened at Har Sinai. It'll probably take us this week and next week, which I think would be an important thing for us to investigate as we enter into Shavuos. This happens to be what we're going to present tonight. Is not completely, it's added to, but the basis of which was actually my senior thesis in to get my bachelor's degree. I was a history major in Yeshiva University, and I don't know why the chair of the department, when I presented to him my senior thesis, I presented to him was what happened at Sinai, a historical analysis, and he agreed to let me do it. So it was general history. It was most of my concentration was actually in the Civil War period, and then this is what, yeah. I guess maybe because Jews are always fighting with each other, he kind of let it happen. So, I'm indebted to him. It was a 30-page essay on what happened at Sinai. It was a amazing thing to study. Actually, my thesis advisor was someone that's on the that's one of the professors in the history department, Rabbi Dr. J.J. Schachter, who is a major Talmud Chacham and an amazing rabbi. So he was my advisor, and so a lot of gratitude to him for helping me work through a lot of this. So the question of what exactly happened at Har Sinai is something that the Rambam cautions us even to study. The Rambam 1138 to 1204, which was arguably the greatest and probably most controversial of all the Rishonim at the same time, where he actually writes in the Moreh Nevuchim, where we know the Rambam wrote 3 books. The Rambam wrote first his Perush HaMishnaos, which is essentially the first art scroll written for the Arabic-speaking community, where he translated the Mishnah into Arabic. He gave summaries from the Gemara. And the bottom line halacha, and he wrote it. The impetus for it was that the motivation was that he noticed that the layperson did not have access to learning Mishnah and Gemara, which was all that was available in the 12th century, and he noticed that no one was really had access to be able to learn because they weren't familiar with Talmudic analysis, and therefore he wanted to make a user-friendly Mishnah. So he translated the Mishnah into Arabic and gave a summary and some explanation. The bottom line halacha that he wrote at the age of 31 years old, covering the span of the entire Mishnah. Then he set off on his magnum opus, which is the Mishnah Torah, where he codifies all of the oral tradition and Jewish law. And he writes in the introduction, essentially, all you need is my book, the Mishnah Torah, and the Tanakh, in order to know our tradition. That took him much longer to write, and is a 14-volume work. And then the Rambam wrote, towards the end of his life, a book of philosophy to combat some of the other philosophy that was popular at the time, whether it be Plato or Aristotle, and he wanted to give the Jewish perspective on a lot of issues that we've discussed, things like free will and the afterlife, and trying to understand the rationality behind some of the mitzvos. And that book actually had a lot of criticism associated with it and a lot of controversy, and we'll hint a little bit to that later. We'll come back to that a little bit later. Mind you, by the way, the Rambam did all this while he was also a full-time doctor. He was the medical advisor to the Sultan, and was able to accomplish all of this at the same time. Which the Rambam was no one was like the Rambam. So anyway, the Rambam writes in his Moreh Nevuchim, he writes, Udu uzichru, that one needs to know and remember, she'efshar sheyachnis adam atzmo l'ma'amad Har Sinai, that it is impossible for any person to properly expound the revelation at Har Sinai. Biyoser mizeh hashir asher zechru shu mechal sitrei Torah. Any more so than what is just found within the Talmud, whatever sort of historical analyses or accounts are given in the Talmud, that's the most that we can understand about what happened on Har Sinai. Beyond that, it is something that is hidden from, it's part of the hidden parts of the Torah. How exactly it occurred, Na'ala mimenu is something that is hidden from us. Kilo kadam kamoso velo yisacher, because there was nothing ever like it, and there never will be anything similar to it, and therefore we have no comparison. We have nothing. There's nothing to compare it to, and therefore it's almost impossible for us to fully comprehend what happened at Har Sinai. With that caution in mind, so let's begin to try and understand using our classic sources, trying to piece together as much as we could what happened at Har Sinai. So it starts with a Gemara in Masechta Matos, where the Gemara tells us the following. It's a Gemara that we've quoted in the past, where the Gemara tells us, Darish Rebbe Simloi gave the following drasha. He said, Sheish Mos v'sholosh esrei mitzvos nemru lo Moshe, that 613 mitzvos were given at Har Sinai, through Moshe Rabbeinu at Har Sinai, 613 commandments. That's, by the way, this is the source of how we know we have 613 commandments, because when you open up a Tanakh, you open up a Gemara, you see there's obviously a lot more than 613 different things a person needs to do. I'll just give you one example. Is we have to say the Shema in the morning and in the evening. Is that one mitzvah or two mitzvah? We have to put tefillin on our hand and on our head. Is that one mitzvah or two mitzvah? Right? There, in every single sacrifice that's brought in the temple, there are 4 common activities, services that are done for every single offering that's brought in the temple. Is that 4 separate mitzvot, or is that one mitzvah? There's many examples of this. So how you get to the number 613 is something that all of the Rishonim struggle with, figuring out what belongs in the list, what doesn't belong in the list, which mitzvah belongs, which mitzvah doesn't. But this is the source. They're all getting back to this Gemara, that we know that the round number is 613, and we're trying to figure out what those 613 are. But this is the source of the round number being 613. So there's 613 commandments, the Gemara tells us. How do we know that there's 613? Says the Gemara, Avram of Nuna, Ma'ikra. What is the textual source that tells me that we have 613 commandments? Because the Torah says, Torah tziva lanu Moshe. Torah was commanded to us through Moshe. Torah is bigematria, the Gemara says, shis mea v'chad sari. Is bigematria shis mea v'chad sari have. It's 611. 611 is the numerical value of the word Torah. Torah was commanded to us. 611 commandments, tziva, were commanded, lanu Moshe, through Moshe. So that's how we know there's 611. How do we know that there are another 2? Because the 611 were taught to us by Moshe. The other 2 were given to us by God. We heard directly from God. That's what the Gemara says. Anochi velo yeh, the first 2 of the 10 commandments, belief in God and not putting faith in any other powers of any other God, quote unquote. Those 2 commandments we heard mipi hagvura shamun. We heard directly the voice of God, directly from the voice of God. We heard those 2 commandments. 2 plus 611 equals 613. So what comes out from this Gemara is that at Har Sinai, we received the 613 commandments, and we heard the voice of God in mass revelation. This is making it very clear. And that's kind of the classical understanding, right? That's the way that we've all kind of understood it. The Ramban gives this classical interpretation of this Gemara, putting it back into the Psukim. For example, the Torah tells us. The Torah tells us in a couple different places in the Torah, in Parshas Yisro and also in Parshas V'eschanan, where the Torah tells us Daber Elohim es kol hadvarim ha'ela lemor, that God spoke all of these things at Har Sinai, right? So the 10 commandments, God spoke at Har Sinai, and we know that two of them, at least the first two, we actually heard the voice of God when we heard when we were told these first two commandments. So in the Ramban's perspective, and just really it's the basic understanding of this Gemara, we know that we had a mass revelation at Sinai, and included in mass revelation was the fact that we actually heard the voice of God. Now, the Rambam, Maimonides, we mentioned before, Maimonides, one of the greatest, the Rishonim, Maimonides, writes actually in his Mishnah Torah, so this is not in his book of philosophy, this is in his book of halacha, where the Rambam in the Mishnah Torah tells us a different account of what happened at Har Sinai. And the backdrop for this Rambam is based off of a simple question he brings up in his Moreh Nevuchim, where he says that how could that be? How could it be that we actually heard a commandment from God? Who are the only types of people that could hear commandments from God? Prophets, angels, prophets, right? Prophets can hear a commandment. The only mortals that can hear a commandment from God are prophets. Right? When the Jewish people were standing at Har Sinai, do we have any sort of account to tell us that they all became prophets? I mean, we actually know that they didn't all become prophets. They didn't all become prophets. They didn't attain they didn't have any prophecy after Ma'amad Har Sinai. So they were prophets only for a isolated period of time, and then they lost their status of being prophets. It's just a very hard thing to assume. That it would make more sense that none of them were prophets at Har Sinai, and they were all the same way that they were before and after, which was just regular folks. There were some prophets at Har Sinai, Moshe, Aaron, Yehoshua, but the average member of Klal Yisrael was not a prophet, and therefore, how is it possible for them to have heard a commandment from God? Only prophets can hear commandments from God. From the word, from the voice of God Himself. So that's a very, very strong question, and what is the motivating factor for the Rambam to give a different account as to what happened at Har Sinai. He writes the following. This comes up, by the way, in the context of how we know we put our trust in Moshe Rabbeinu, Moshe, the greatest prophet that ever was and ever will be. The Rambam says if we don't believe that, that would mean that it would make us a non-believer. So the Rambam writes the following. He says, Moshe Rabbeinu lo ha'aminu bo Yisrael, that Moshe Rabbeinu gained our trust as a Jewish people, mipnei ha'otot she'asa she'amin al pi ha'otot, that we gained we started to believe in Moshe Rabbeinu not on account of the different miracles that he did, because yesh v'libo dofi she'efshar she'aseh ha'ot ba'ahat v'kishuv, because it's possible that all of those miracles that Moshe Rabbeinu did with the plagues and the initial miracles he did with the snake and all of those miracles he did, it's possible that was done all through sorcery. So those would not have been legitimate reasons for us to put our full faith in Moshe Rabbeinu. Those could not have been the reasons, says the Rambam. Which, by the way, this in and of itself is a very, very interesting question of how do we know that Moshe was the greatest prophet that ever was and ever will be? Why do we put so much faith in Moshe Rabbeinu? It's not because of the miracles that he performed. The miracles he performed, okay, those could have been good magic tricks, good sorcery. Rather, rather all of the signs, all of the different acts he performed in the wilderness, he only did them because he needed to do them at that time. It wasn't in order to prove his legitimacy and his authenticity and his prophecy. It was because those things needed to be done in order for the Jewish people to go through the process of redemption, to go through the Exodus. Rather, why is it that we believe in him? Why? How do we know we believe in Moshe Rabbeinu the way that we do? B'ma'amad Har Sinai. It was due to the revelation, the assembly at Har Sinai. She'anu ru'u v'lo zar v'oznav sham'u v'lo acher ha'esh v'hakolos v'halapidim. Because When our eyes saw and no one else's saw, meaning we saw with our own eyes, and we had the mass revelation of what Moshe Rabbeinu was able to bring forth at Har Sinai, v'unigash el arafal v'hakol medaber alav, and we heard the voice speaking a love to Moshe. This is the key point over here. We heard the voice speaking to Moshe. V'anu, we shomim Moshe, Moshe. We heard Moshe, Moshe. This is a quote of us hearing what God is saying. Leich emor lahem kach v'kach. Go tell them such and such. V'chein hu omer panim bepanim diber Hashem imachem. So essentially, the Rambam is saying, how do we know we put our faith in Moshe Rabbeinu? Because we heard God speak to Moshe Rabbeinu. It's not because of any other miracles he did, but rather the reason we know Moshe Rabbeinu is the greatest prophet that ever was and ever will be, because we witnessed him using that level of prophecy. We witnessed him speaking to God, panim el panim, face to face at Har Sinai, at the revelation at Sinai. So what comes out from the Rambam over here? What did we hear at Har Sinai? Did we hear any commandments from God? No. What was it that all we heard? All we heard, I'll read the words of the Rambam again. Anu shomim, what we heard was Moshe, Moshe, lech emor lahem, kach v'kach. Moshe, Moshe, go tell them such and such. Go tell them such and such. Now, how does that resolve the Rambam's question? Remember what the Rambam's question was? The Rambam's question was that I thought that we weren't prophets. But if we weren't prophets, how are we able to hear the voice of God? That wasn't the question. The question was not how are we able to hear the voice of God. Nothing wrong with being able to hear the voice of God. If a person's a prophet, it gives them the exclusive ability to be able to hear a commandment from God. That's what prophets do. They're given a commandment, go and command the Jewish people to do such and such, and that the prophet needs to, they have a mission they need to do. They need to go do their job and tell over what they heard in their prophecy. We as a Jewish people, when we heard God speaking to Moshe, we heard God giving Moshe commandments, and we were witness to that. We ourselves did not receive any commandments through the voice of God. We heard God giving those commandments over to Moshe, which would mean the way that you have to understand the Gemara we just saw before, because this isn't the Gemara we saw before, make it very clear that the 611 commandments we heard directly from Moshe, right? And the additional 2 we heard from God. And that's how you get to the number 613. So what do we do with that? So there, the Rambam would have to say that those mitzvot, and this is that's why I say this part of the Rambam is very controversial. That you have to say that what happened was that when we heard, you have one of 2 answers. Either it's that when we heard God say, Moshe, Moshe, go tell them kach v'kach, go tell them this and that, we heard God say that by the first 2 commandments. That prior to the commandment of belief in God, Anochi Hashem Elokecha, Asher tzitzicha me'eretz Mitzrayim mebeis avadim, prior to hearing the commandment of emunah and the commandment of idolatry, not believing in any other gods, lo yeh lechem acharim elokim acharim al panai, not belief in any other gods, that it was prior to those 2 commandments, we heard God say to Moshe, 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 go tell the Jewish people, kach v'kach, go tell them this and that. That it could very well be that it was only by those 2 commandments, not by all 613, or not by all 10 commandments, but it was by those 2 commandments that we heard this quote of God instructing Moshe to tell us these commandments. The other is that we did not only hear for the first 2 commandments. The other answer would be that for the first 2 commandments, perhaps we did hear God give the command, but he gave it not directed towards the Jewish people. We heard God directing those commandments to Moshe, right? And then Moshe relayed them to us. As opposed to the rest of the 613 mitzvos, where we did not hear what the commandment was. All we heard was God tell Moshe, tell the Jewish people such and such. So bottom line, though, is that according to the Rambam, it's a very different narrative than what we have probably ever, the classic narrative. This is not the classic narrative. The classic narrative is that we heard directly from God, and that's the way most midrashim bring it down. It's the basic reading of the Gemara, that we heard directly from God in mass revelation to believe in Him and not follow any other powers. And the rest of the 613 mitzvos we heard from Moshe Rabbeinu. But the Rambam is assuming no, because of the fact that we were not prophets, we could not have heard the commandments directly from God. It must be that we just what we experienced at Har Sinai was a mass revelation of being able to actually hear the voice of God, and the fact that it was confirmed that Moshe Rabbeinu was the greatest prophet, in that we actually heard God talking to Moshe. And then Moshe relayed everything to us. Both traditions clearly distinguish Judaism from other religions, right? Because, what other religion did the entire people in mass hear the word of God? And we're taking one man's word over the fact that they heard God. This is I think Judaism is the only religion that believes in the fact that there was really a mass revelation, and that we all heard the word of God. Now, Moshe Rabbeinu was the greatest prophet, and therefore he heard more than everyone else, and he heard the commandments directly from God according to the Rambam, or the rest of the commandments according to the Ramban. No matter how you put it, clearly Moshe Rabbeinu heard more directly from God, but we actually heard the voice of God. That's according to everybody. We actually heard the voice of God, and it was confirmed at Har Sinai that Moshe Rabbeinu was this prophet that was unsurpassed and unparalleled, was the greatest prophet that ever was and ever will be. So those are things we know for sure happened at Har Sinai. And by the way, I will point out the Rivash, who was a Spanish Rishon from the 14th century, where he has a responsa where he defends some of the criticism towards the Rambam. There's a lot of criticism that came out against the Rambam in the 12th and 13th century, mostly in the 13th century, especially over the Mor Nevuchim, which is this book of philosophy the Rambam wrote, a lot of the things some of the things the Rambam writes in there, it is hard to wrap your head around why the Rambam would write what he writes. And so the Rivash has a responsa defending the Rambam, and he says, basically the Rambam, you have to understand, was fighting was trying to fight assimilation into other philosophies, and was trying to essentially sell the Torah while contending with Aristotelian philosophy, which was a tough thing to be able to do. So we want to use similar language, and that's why some things in the Rambam didn't come out exactly according to our normative Jewish tradition. They came out a little bit odd, but nevertheless, he says the Rambam was totally kosher in his intentions in it, and we need to be able to study them and understand how they fit into normative Judaism. That's what the Rivash says. He says, though, that the Rambam, even the Rambam, who entered into the depths of Greek philosophy in trying to defend Torah, he himself didn't come out unscathed. Where the Rivash then goes on to give a caution to us in our engagement with philosophy. We gave a class on that. How long was that? It was already right after Sukkot, probably. We gave a class on that about the study of philosophy and Jewish philosophy and other philosophy, where the Rivash gives a caution saying you need to be careful studying other philosophy because you see, even the Rambam didn't come out unscathed. What's the one example that the Rivash gives of how we know the Rambam didn't come out unscathed in his study of philosophy? It's this. This is his example that he gives, because the question the Rambam asked of, well, we weren't prophets, how are we able to hear the command of God? We're talking about Ma'amad Har Sinai. We're talking about God in mass revelation. We also don't hear the voice of God ever, right? We're talking about God in mass revelation. The rules were kind of broken. right? It's like we're talking about God was kind of taking control of the whole thing. He's always taking control of everything, but we were brought into a realm that we are never brought into. And so perhaps in that realm, there'd be nothing wrong with us experiencing some form of a prophecy. The fact that the Rambam was so bothered by that shows that he was affected deeply by the rationalistic perspective of Greek philosophy or Aristotelian philosophy, to the point that it was what motivated him to come to this abnormal expression of the tradition of what took place at Har Sinai. That's what the Rivash suggests.
But in the Tanakh, it's pretty consistent that Hashem only speaks to the Navis.
For sure,
So
but because Maimon Har Sinai, I mean, it's pretty consistent in Tanakh that that God is hidden from us. This was inconsistent. Maimon Har Sinai, by its nature, was inconsistent with the way that God interacts with mortals in general, right? So then why is it that we're going to pigeonhole prophecy, that it's not going to, that we wouldn't be able to hear a command of God? Either way, we're hearing the voice of God. Like, why not? Right? That's kind of like why the Rivash thinks that this was an example of where the Rambam's rationalistic perspective may have gotten the better of him in this particular scenario. Nevertheless, I mean, I wouldn't say such a thing if the Rivash didn't say so. The Rivash, can say such things. I can't speak like that about the Rambam. But nevertheless, these are two traditions we have, but the common denominator between both traditions is definitely we had a mass revelation, and that mass revelation confirmed the high level of prophecy, the unprecedented and unparalleled level of prophecy that Moshe Rabbeinu had. Yeah, Jack.
So what are the consequences of
Are there consequences? I think that the consequences would be in a philosophical realm when trying to part of what the Rambam writes, part of Emunah, in getting to a core belief of God is studying Maimon Har Sinai. Maimon Har Sinai is part of the proof of our belief in God. And depending on what account you take, may relate to how great of what the definition of Emunah is. Is the definition of Emunah knowing God in terms of knowing what God expects of us, knowing the morality that God has given to the world in the blueprint of the world through the Torah, or is it actually trying to prove God? And that's kind of more of the Rambam approach, which leads to its own issues. So I'd say it's more of it creates philosophical ramifications that would lead into ramifications in Emunah and our relationship with God. But from a practical standpoint, we celebrate Shavuos both according to the Ramban and the Rambam, exactly the same. Yeah. So with this in mind, I wanted to just bring up what basically is, as we mentioned, the common denominator between both of these approaches is the fact that we have this mass revelation, and that this mass revelation really changed the course of human history. As we know, we read in the Haggadah that had God only brought us to Har Sinai and not given us the Torah, that would have been dayenu, that would have been enough to celebrate. What exactly does that mean? So most of the commentaries explain that the first person I heard this from was Rabbi Sachs, that had God only brought us the Torah, but not given us God only brought us rather to Har Sinai and not given us the Torah, what good would that have been? Right? Just to go and see Har Sinai. Why would that be something that's significant? So perhaps, and I think most commentaries explain this in the Haggadah, that when we say had God only brought us to Har Sinai and we experienced the mass revelation, that would have been enough. That would have been enough even if he didn't give us the Torah. Why would that have been enough to have a mass revelation? So when you have a mass revelation, what happens is more than just either that core belief in God or a belief in the prophecy of Moshe, like the Rambam said, but it's more than just experiencing a belief. What you're experiencing is clarity in life, where it's possible we would not have technically needed the Torah after the mass revelation. Once we had the mass revelation, for the Jewish people who experienced it, and we know all of our souls were there, but practically speaking, the physical people who were there that actually experienced physically Ma'amad Har Sinai, they perhaps would not have needed, quote unquote, the Torah, because their clarity in life, in what is true and false, what is ethical, what is not, would have been so clear. I mean, when you experience God, then everything, all the gray turns into black and white, right? And it's much easier to navigate through life. And therefore, you may not need the Torah, because what is the ultimate purpose of the Torah? As the Rambam writes in his Perush Mishnah, the ultimate purpose of the Torah, and the reason why it's so important to study Torah, is because it gives us a guide for how to be a ethical, moral, and upstanding person in life. And so, had we had the mass revelation, that perhaps would have been enough for us to have that clarity in order to live our lives according to the way that God would have wanted us to live our lives, had we not received the Torah. Obviously, God knew that we needed the Torah regardless, but that's what it means. That is why the mass revelation is something that is so significant, because through that mass revelation, you gain a clarity. We experience that when we meet, either, very, very righteous people, a very righteous woman, a very, a brilliant rabbi, that sometimes when you have an issue and you want to get some guidance on how to deal with that issue, very often, at least my experience has been that when something that I thought was complex, I'll go and sit, and before I even ask the question, right, before I even present the dilemma, just from being in their presence, I already know the answer, right? When you're in the presence of someone that's got it right, that knows what's right and wrong, so then the dilemma falls away. You gain clarity. All the more so, when we're talking about God, right? And you have that experience with God, so then of course the clarity of life is going to be made very. That was the experience I always had with my grandfather Zatzal. That my grandfather was not it was no complexity to him. It was just, everything in life was just so clear. There was no complexity. It was just so clear. And so when I'd be verhitzt about something, I'd be upset, or something would be on my mind. I'd be, and I'd be going through a dilemma or whatever it was. I didn't have to spend more than 5 minutes with her grandfather, not even talking about the issue, and it would be resolved. Sometimes you meet people like that. So that's what the Jewish people perhaps experienced at Har Sinai in that mass revelation as well. There's a quote that I think really captures all this, from one of the Roshei Kollel at Yeshiva University. He wrote an article a number of years ago. I think it was back in 2010. He wrote an article about Har Sinai, about Ma'amad Har Sinai, the revelation at Sinai, the assembly at Sinai, and there's a quote from that I think sums this up perfectly. He says, Jewish tradition asserts, this is from Rabbi Rosenzweig Shalita. Jewish tradition asserts that the greatest moment and most important event in history was not the creation of the world, but the revelation of the Torah, Matan Torah. Rabbinic sources perceive the giving of the Torah at Mount Sinai as both the climax and telos of creation. Strikingly, the Medrash articulates this view even as it interprets the account of creation itself, noting that the very term Bereshit in the beginning signifies the anticipation of revelation for the sake of the Torah, which is called the beginning. Halacha mandates that the Jewish people maximize their connection to the experience of revelation and intensify their commitment to the content of revelation by means of rigorous Torah study and Torah observance. Torah life constitutes a divine gift to the Jewish people, a cherished opportunity, the gateway to a spiritually rich and meaningful existence, right? And by connecting ourselves to the mass revelation, so then that is a gateway to that experience of having that clarity in the moral and ethical life that we're supposed to live and the meaningful existence we're supposed to have. There's a comment that's made by the Bar Tanura, who's a 15th century, early 16th century commentary on the Mishnah, written by Rabbeinu Avadia Bar Tanura of Italy, where he explains the very first Mishnah in Pirkei Avos. Moshe Kibal Torah Misinai. Moshe Rabbeinu received the Torah from Har Sinai at Har Sinai, and he discusses why is it that that this account of Moshe receiving the Torah at Har Sinai, which is the only place it comes up in the Mishnah, why does it come up at the beginning of Pirkei Avos, which is a book of ethics? Why is it found in the beginning of a book of ethics? Really, this should be the opening line to all of Mishnah, to the entire oral tradition. Know that Moshe Rabbeinu received the Torah at Har Sinai. This is what this is how it was passed down, and here are the laws. Let's begin the first Mishnah. However, the Rebbe wants to start brachos. Okay, fine. Why is it that Rebbe Hakadosh, who edited the Mishnayos, puts this teaching about the fact that we received the Torah at Har Sinai all the way at the beginning of the book of ethics? So the Bar Tanura explains, he says, Omer Ani, it would seem to me, Lefisha Mesechtazu Eina Miusedet al Perish Mitzvah Mitzvah Torah. He says that this tractate of Pirkei Avos is not analyzing mitzvot from the Torah, right? Unlike, let's say, the tractate of Sukkah, which obviously is dealing with the holiday of Sukkos, right? So it's analyzing mitzvot that are contained within the Torah. And that's what all of the different tractates are in the Mishnah. He says this one, Pirkei Avos, though, is not. It's a book of ethics. Ela kulo musarim umidos. It all has to do with character development. V'chachmei umas ha'olam. And the rest of the nations of the world also, gam kein chibru sfarim kemo shebadu melibam. They also wrote their books of philosophy and self-help books and books of ethics, all in different countries and in different nationalities and different cultures. All have their books of philosophies, etc. How people are supposed to act with one another. Lefikach, therefore, Rebbe wanted to open up our book of ethics by saying, Moshe Kibel Torah Misinai, to tell us that Moshe Rabbeinu received the Torah at Har Sinai. Why? What does one have anything to do with the other? Lomar Lecha, to tell us, Shahamidos v'hamusarim shebezu hamasechta, to tell us that all of the ethics that are contained within Pirkei Avos, all of our ethics, the guide of how to be a mensch, also came from Har Sinai. That we did not make this up. This is not that we had some sort of an ethical conference that decided this is how a Jew is supposed to act. This is how you deal with ethical dilemmas. This is how you deal with issues of social justice. This is how a person is supposed to treat their neighbor. These things were not made up in a vacuum by our rabbis, but it's part of a tradition at Har Sinai. Now, what was that tradition at Har Sinai? It's going back to that sense of clarity. The clarity that the Jewish people experienced at Har Sinai trickled down throughout the ages, down to Pirkei Avos. When Rebbe is spelling out different ethics and morals that a person is supposed to live by. All that came from that initial clarity that we experienced in mass revelation at Har Sinai. I'll just close with a beautiful idea, a short thought related to Shavuos, which is why is it that the Torah was given at Har Sinai? So you look at the Medrash, and the Medrash tells us because Har Sinai was different than the other mountains. How is it different than the other mountains? Because it was a medium-sized mountain, it was an average-sized mountain, telling us that the Torah is supposed to be Mis Sinai. It's supposed to be given in a humble kind of a way, that is supposed to be part of the way one is supposed to experience Torah. One's supposed to be humble, just like Har Sinai was. We're not supposed to be gaivadik. We're not supposed to be haughty and full of ourselves, the Jewish people, over the fact that we have the Torah. No, it's a great responsibility. We have the Torah. We need to be humble about it. We have a certain mission in life, and that was represented by the mountain of Har Sinai. So I have a question for everybody. So then why wasn't the Torah given in a valley? Right? I mean, if we're trying to express a sense of humility, so then we give it at a low place. What? Right, the Dead Sea, something like that. Har Sinai is still a mountain. It's still a mountain. So Reb Tzadok of Lublin says, because when one experiences when one experiences a mass revelation, when one has the Torah, and they have the clarity that's contained from the Torah, so then one needs to know, one needs to recognize that, yes, you need to remain humble, but you're still standing on top of the mountain. That one needs to view themselves like they're on top of the world. They have this clarity of life. Like when you're standing on top of the mountain and you look out and you see everything from that kind of a view, right? It's the sense of like, wow, look at like I'm standing on top of a mountain. Look what I've accomplished, right? Look at how great we can become. So that we should not feel like we're in a valley. It's not about feeling low. It's about connecting to the Torah. It's about having the clarity that comes from the mass revelation, and therefore feeling great as such. Now you need to be careful. You need to check that with humility. It was on Har Sinai. It was a medium-sized mountain, but nevertheless, one needs to feel the sense of clarity, the sense of greatness that can come through connecting themselves to that mass revelation. Okay, so just like once again to review, and then we'll close, is that what exactly had happened at Har Sinai, as we mentioned from the Rambam, is impossible to know exactly. But what we do know are certain things. We do know for sure there was a mass revelation. That's just from basic reading of the Pesukim of the Torah. It's pretty clear from the Gemara that we actually heard the voice of God. We actually, mamish, heard the voice of God. And it's just a question in the Rishonim, to what extent did we hear the voice of God? The Ramban says we actually heard at least two of the commandments directly from the voice of God. We actually were given the commandment directly from God. Or the Rambam says that no, that's a little bit of a stretch because we were not on the level of prophets, but we did hear Moshe conversing with God, and God actually speaking to Moshe, telling Moshe to give us the commandments, which confirmed not only this belief in God, in mass revelation, the only religion that believes such a thing, but also confirmed the legitimacy, the authenticity, and the level of prophecy that was unparalleled that Moshe Rabbeinu was able to attain, in the fact that he was able to speak with God directly. That was not confirmed by all the miracles he did in Egypt. Miracles he did in Egypt were for a different reason. That what confirmed our understanding and our belief over the fact that Moshe was unparalleled in his prophecy was the fact that we heard the conversation taking place between God and Moshe Rabbeinu at Har Sinai. And when we have that experience of a mass revelation that we're going to be celebrating on Shavuos, so then we have the clarity to be able to guide us in our lives, not only through the direct mitzvos and the strict dry law that was given at Har Sinai, but as a source of guidance to guide us through the rest of our lives in our ethics and morality, to live a most meaningful life. We will next week, part 2 is going to be discussing, so when we say we received the Torah at Har Sinai, to what extent did we receive the Torah at Har Sinai? Well, what does that mean we received the Torah at Har Sinai? We received all the Torah, some of the Torah. That may be even more difficult question to answer than the one we were trying to answer tonight, which is what happened in the mass revelation. Okay, fine, we have the mass revelation, we received the Torah. How much of the Torah was received? How did we receive all the 613 commandments? These are the questions we're going to pick up with next week. All right, we'll stop here for now. All right. Good, everybody.
Thank you. Thanks. Thank you.
Bye, guys.